Ready? Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Bob Unger. I happen to be an attorney, but don't hold it against me. And I'm here with my sidekick, Daniel Zeng, and you'll see why he's my sidekick. And we're going to be interviewing a very prolific and knowledgeable writer, and I'm not exaggerating, no hyperbole here. And Alex Newman, our guest, is not only a prolific writer, but he wrote a book called The Crimes of the Educators, which I recommend that every parent get so that they truly understand what is going on in the schools across this country and why it is that so many kids are either very weak readers or just nominally literate. And I'm going to start off with just one example. This book, McGuffey's Reader, is the 1828 version of the Reader that was predominantly used in the United States to teach kids reading, spelling, grammar, you know, all those unimportant things. They weren't teaching them the various uses of a condom in those days. They were actually teaching kids how to read. And I'm going to read to you an example from page 61 of the 1828 McGuffey's Reader. But all the moral energies of the government of God over men are indissolubly associated with the ministry of reconciliation. The Sabbath and the preaching of the gospel are heaven's consecrated instrumentality for the efficacious administration of the government of mind in a happy social state. By these only does the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his beams, and ignorance and vice and superstition encamp around evangelical institutions to rush in whenever their light and power is extinct. Okay? Isn't that the same as C-Spot Run? Isn't that the level? We've gone from this to C-Spot Run. And if you're lucky, they can read C-Spot Run. And with me is Daniel, because Daniel comes from a Chinese immigrant family. English is not the first language of the home, obviously. And Daniel, his mother is the owner of Lin Pan International Real Estate. She is the #1 real estate agent, especially in terms of Asian clients all over Manhattan and the boroughs and the counties around Manhattan. In fact, in order for a Chinese person to get into America, she has to approve them and they have to buy a house, otherwise they can't come. Only a joke. But at any rate, Daniel was taught to read by my wife. And my wife doesn't have an education degree. She has a PhD in a real subject, science. But she mastered the English language and all the rules of spelling and studied it in a scientific way and taught Daniel to read when he was only 5 years old. And on the Chinese movies and television shows, they have, the subtitles underneath. And they go zooming by, zoom, 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 zoom. And I sent the video to some of my American friends, and they said that the letters are going by too fast and they can't read it. Daniel sits under the TV set and goes, and he reads it, boom, 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 because he's got automaticity. He's got what they call learned competence, unconscious competence, which comes from correlating the sounds with the letters. So now we're going to get into your book, Crimes of the Educators, and find out why that is. And one of the great things about your writings, not only in the book, but also in your various articles for the New American magazine and WorldNet Daily, is that you use primary source information. In other words, when you want, in law, there's something called an admission against interest. It's the idea that when someone says something, that is against their own interests. It means it's usually reliable because normally people don't say things that inure to their detriment. And these people, who are the founders of our education system, tell you exactly what they're going to do to your kids, and by golly, they've done it. So let's go back to the beginning, and we'll let you give us a little narrative of how this all started, okay?
Well, thank you very much, Bob. It's great to be with you. Thank you, Daniel, for being with us. And I think this is one of the most important subjects because, you know, being able to read really opens up the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of mankind going back thousands of years. And if you can't read, you basically depend on CNN, on the television, on your government school teachers. So reading is one of those subjects that I think is probably at the top in terms of the priority list of what people need to learn, because again, it allows you to access any kind of information you want. You want to learn about science, you want to learn about history, you want to learn about government, about law. If you can read, you can do any of those things. And what happened with the story of reading in the United States is a tragedy of monumental proportions. There's basically several ways that reading can be taught or is taught. There's the correct way, and then there are incorrect ways. The correct way, we have a phonetic writing system because the letters are phonetic. They represent certain sounds. And so to be able to teach reading and writing with our alphabet system, you have to understand the correlation between the sound and the symbol, and you have to understand how to join them together. And so this has been the case for thousands of years since we've been using phonetic characters to write, so back going all the way to the Phoenicians. But there was deaf children, and in the early 1800s, there was the Reverend Golodet in Connecticut in particular was the one who really pioneered this in this country. And he thought, hey, deaf children, you can't teach them the sound of a letter because they can't hear the sound. And so let's try something new. And so he thought, why don't I teach them to memorize entire words as if the words themselves were the symbol, kind of like in Chinese writing, where a character, a symbol, actually represents an entire word or an idea, which is different than the system that we use in English and the European languages and so on. And so this reverend, it was a great idea to teach deaf children that way. They wouldn't become good readers, but at least the page would be accessible to them. You know, a really smart one could maybe memorize a few hundred, maybe even a few thousand words. And so they might not be able to understand everything written on a page, but if they could get 3/4 of the words, they could figure out by context what the other ones meant. And it would be a slow process and an arduous process, but at least they could make sense of what was written on the page. Well, Horace Mann comes along, and Horace Mann really was a collectivist. He was the one who really advanced the idea of government control over education in the United States, starting in the 1830s. All the way into the 1840s. And he thought, hey, right away when government got involved in education, the quackery was unleashed, right? They didn't have to compete in the marketplace for customers. They didn't have to, convince parents that it was a good idea. So right away, the quackery was born. They started teaching all the teachers about phrenology, right? The idea that the shape of your skull was going to determine your personality, absolute quackery. And they introduced quackery in terms of reading. This Horace Mann thought, hey, why don't we try this method that they use on deaf children in Connecticut at this asylum? Why don't we try this on the non-deaf children in the public schools in Boston? And they did, and it was a total disaster. I've actually got behind me a book called, right there, The New Illiterates, is that blue one right there. It was written by Samuel Blumenfeld in 1973, who I co-wrote Crimes of the Educators with. And in the appendix, he actually reprinted an essay that was written by all the schoolmasters in Boston. They all got together after a couple of years of this quackery with the whole word method. And they said, look, Mr. Mann, we tried out your silly system. It didn't work. The children are not learning how to read this way. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. We've seen the results now. The children can't read. And so we're just going to go back to doing what we've done for thousands of years. That worked really well. And that you would think that would be the end of it, right? So it was totally discredited. Everybody who was following education issues at that time recognized that this quackery was just silly. And then you would think we'd never hear about it again, right? Except maybe in an asylum for deaf children, maybe. Well, John Dewey came along around the turn of the century, late 1800s into the early 1900s. And this guy was another communist. He had these grandiose ideas about reforming humanity through the education system, very much like Horace Mann. He thought we were going to eliminate 90% of the crimes in the world by having government mold the minds of the children. John Dewey comes along. He's an actual communist. He actually went to the Soviet Union to go inspect their schools there, see what they're doing. He loved it. And he resurrected this whole word quackery that had been tried out under Horace Mann. He actually got a grant, I think it was $3.1 million from the Rockefeller Foundation. It was called the General Education Board, one of the philanthropic so-called organizations of the Rockefellers.
3.1 million in what year?
This was in the early 1900s. So that was huge, huge money back then.
Money.
That's right. So he set up an experimental school at the University of Chicago, where he was given a bunch of children, and he got to try out his quackery, and including on some of the Rockefeller children, by the way, which was interesting. And they ended up illiterate. Right? They could not read and write properly. And John Dewey thought, hey, this will be perfect. Let's do this all over America. Sorry,
right? For the Rockefellers, karma. You know,
that's right. Right. Serves them right. That's right. And you know, they were very fortunate in that they were so wealthy, they could hire secretaries to do all their reading and writing, right? The secretary could read the letter to them and, you know, write a response. But for a normal person who can't afford a secretary, a personal assistant to read everything, it becomes very problematic. But, you know, that I think is very conclusive evidence of intent, right? The first time this was tried, it was exposed as absolute quackery. The second time it was tried, they knew these children were struggling mightily to be able to read. And so John Dewey got together with a bunch of his colleagues, and they started developing readers based on these reading theories. So they created the Dick and Jane series. They created the Macmillan readers, right? And by the end of World War II, these were really, you know, America had a lot of money after that. We weren't spending it all on tanks and bombs and sending troops overseas. And so they said, hey, let's buy up all new textbooks for the schools. And they bought up all these John Dewey inspired textbooks to teach reading. And very, very shortly thereafter, we had a reading calamity in this country. It was so disastrous, it actually inspired Rudolph Flesch to write Why Johnny Can't Read in the year 1955. I mean, it only took 12 years for the problem to become so enormous. We had millions of illiterates. And, you know, the rest is history. So this got exposed in this book. People said, hey, we want phonics back in the schools. We want our children to read. So the school said, okay, we'll put that back in. And just constant, the education establishment insisting that, no, we have to use the whole word method. And they started disguising it with new terms, the look-say method, you know, the sight word method, the memorization method. But it was all the same quackery. And they still use it today under Common Core. This quackery, they still have kindergartners memorizing entire words as if the words were symbols.
And is there a reason that's even deeper than their ignorance, stupidity? Or is there something deeper involved in this?
I think it's malice. I think they wanted to deliberately create a nation of illiterates. And if you go back and you read John Dewey's writings, it comes through very, very clearly that he did not want a highly educated population. In the book Crimes of the Educators, we actually reprinted in the appendix an essay that John Dewey wrote in 1898 called The Primary Education Fetish. And it's interesting that he calls it a fetish that we educate our children and teach them how to read and do math.
Like
right?
it's a very sexual perversion.
Right, exactly. It's a very, very interesting choice of terminology considering what's going on in the schools today. And he didn't even spell it with the same spelling we would use today. But it's an incredible essay. I mean, it is so revealing because what he says is, you know, we spend all this time teaching our little children how to read and how to write and how to do math and how to be precise in their spelling, when really that's not what they need. What they actually need is to be properly socialized. We need to work on, getting them to think in new terms. He didn't come out and say we want to create the new Soviet man, but very close, right? And so
socialismized.
That's right. That's exactly right. And so he outlined in plain black and white letters. We don't want the little children to know how to read and how to do math. Maybe we can do that stuff later. The primary goal ought to be the socialization. And he uses the language of a conspirator in this essay, Bob. He says, for example, and this is almost a direct quote. How did it go? All right, so it's not almost a direct quote, but he says, we've got to go slowly on this because if we go too quickly, it would jeopardize the final success of our effort by causing a violent reaction. So he used the term violent reaction. He knew if parents and teachers, educators, and school administrators and taxpayers and legislators, if they understood that, we were going to basically dumb down our children on purpose, they'd break out the tar and feathers. So it would not go over well. So he said, we got to do it quietly. We've got to do it gradually. And, here we are 100 years later. And according to the government's own data, over 2/3 of eighth graders are not proficient in reading.
And of course, if you bring it back to more modern times, bring it forward, I should say, you had that quote from Dr. Thomas Stitch, who was Undersecretary of Labor under Robert Reich in the Clinton administration, where he says that basically what we want is a manageable workforce. We're not looking for highly literate people. We only need a small elite cadre of highly educated and innovative people, which is necessary for change. So in other words, we don't need functional readers. We don't need people who can self-educate or, God forbid, educate their kids. We need a bunch of dumb drones, and boy, do they get them.
That's exactly right, Bob. And, you know, I've observed this up close and personal. I had the privilege of going to elite international schools during my education, and they taught me how to read with phonics. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was at an elite French school in Mexico City, and I still remember the drills. We were learning in Spanish and French, but it was the same concept. You learn the letter, what it looks like, what it's called, and you learn the sound associated with it. Then you move toward blending them together. This is how they were teaching the children of diplomats and CEOs and politicians to read. Meanwhile, your average American is stuck in a government school, sitting there memorizing see, spot, run, spot, run. And then, you know, people wonder, well, why do we have this elite and you know, the poor and the middle class can't seem to get out of it? Well, that you were dumbed down on purpose. And you know, I think the evidence is overwhelming that the people who engineered this system, and I want to be clear, not the average teacher. The average teacher went and got an education degree. They were told this is how you do it. You know, the government taught them how to teach reading, and they said anyone who disagrees with it. They've actually called teaching phonics part of a right-wing conspiracy. Okay? And it's just so insane. But that's the truth. You know, the elite send their children to fancy private schools where they teach them how to read properly. Your average American sends their children to a government school where the government school teacher has been indoctrinated by the government to teach reading using this quackery.
Well, the teachers take their orders. They're trained in the schools of education. There's a very good book by Rita Kramer called Ed School Follies, where she actually attended a plethora of different schools of education. And she reprints in the book the absolute garbage these teachers are being indoctrinated with, having nothing to do with academic rigor, all having to do with feelings, nothing more than feelings, no intelligence, just feelings. And boy, they've done quite a job. They're incompetent in teaching reading, but they're competent in dumbing down your kids.
That's right. And, you know, you have the kids now, they know all about gender theory. They know all about, you know, that the gas we exhale is a toxic pollution and only the UN can save us. But you ask them, you know, anything basic about anything that matters. Ask them about the scientific method, right? The same people who brought you Common Core created the next generation science standards. 12 years of so-called science instruction. You will never learn the term the scientific method unless you have a rogue teacher who deviates from the script. That ought to tell you something. In 12 years of science lessons, you'll never have the scientific method taught to you. It's part of a plan. It's the reason why Americans today are so poorly educated. It's the reason why, you know, some percentage of them, it's hard to know how many, can actually watch CNN and actually think that they're being given real news. I mean, this would be completely out of the question. It would be completely impossible if the American people were even reasonably educated, and yet several generations of overt dumbing down, and now we are where we are.
Well, we talked about in the beginning, McGuffey's Reader. This is the fourth reader. This is for elementary school children. And you heard how sophisticated the language is and the kind of ability you would need as far as reading is concerned. Also, the Federalist Papers, which were written by Jay Hamilton and Madison, that was written for the average American to try to convince the average American to support ratification of the Constitution. And for any of you parents out there who can still read, go to the Federalist Papers and try reading it and understand that that was not for attorneys. It was for very sophisticated people. And being an attorney, I can tell you that I spoke to the chief bar examiner of the United States, and she basically said, I'm paraphrasing her, that this was the dumbest group of law school graduates she had ever seen. So when lawyers are at that level, what do you think the average plumber is going to be able to do? Now, why do you think it is that the parents have no clue, basically? Very few parents have a clue. They believe all the garbage they're fed by the members of the teachers union. I don't call them educators. I call them members of the teachers union. Why do you think it is? What phenomena exists in this country now that parents are so clueless?
Well, I think it goes right back to the education system, Bob. Our parents' generation, my parents' generation, was also dumbed down in the public schools, and their parents were also dumbed down in the public schools. And, just as Dewey explained, it was a gradual process. So the dumbing down has gotten more and more extreme, more and more progressive with each generation. But they've done it at a slow enough pace where parents didn't, they might have been suspicious and like, hey, should they really be learning this? But it happened slow enough that your average parent didn't catch what was happening. They were dumbed down themselves. Their parents were dumbed down themselves. And so it didn't hit them in the face like a ton of bricks as it would have if we had gone directly from, the education we had in the 1890s to the education we had in the 1990s. It would have been obvious to everybody. It never would have been possible. But successive generations of dumbing down, successive generations of fake news, getting worse and worse as time goes on. And we've ended up in the situation we're in today.
I'll tell you a funny story. I was asked by a friend of mine to be the speaker at a conservative. When I say conservative, I don't mean politically, but conservative is basically today the same as the liberal reform Jewish temples. And he asked me to give a speech. Big mistake on his part because they practically kicked him out of the temple when I got finished. So I get up in front of this crowd and I explained to them that the only way you can tell if your child can actually read is at a young age, let's say second grade, you put the Wall Street Journal in front of the child and you ask him to read it out loud. And you, in a very benign way, you stand behind him and you make sure he's reading the words accurately. Then you'll know if the kid can read. And it's most telling when they get to a word that's above their level. If they know how to read, they'll be able to read the word because they'll sound it out. It's like if you were to read, or if I were to read my wife's doctoral thesis in genetic engineering, you would read it, but I would doubt, like me, I would doubt that we would really understand it because we don't have the experiential recognition of these concepts unless we have a high level of science knowledge, which I certainly don't have. That's why I'm a lawyer. But at any rate, can you still hear me, by the way? Because the screen just stopped. Huh.
There you go.
You came back. So anyway, when I finished talking, a school teacher who was probably retired, or she's borderline retired. I didn't say retarded, although I could. Retired. And she gets up and she says, "You don't know what you're talking about. My granddaughter is an excellent reader, but she doesn't know how to read out loud." So I said, "What do you mean she doesn't know how to read out loud? Is she capable of speaking? Is she a deaf mute? Why can't she read out loud?" And I turned to the audience and I said, "There you are, Exhibit A for the prosecution." And that was it.
That is the thinking today that comes out of the education school. I mean, you can read the papers by these people, and some of the examples would just blow your mind. I saw a professional educator, PhD, said, if the word says horse and the child reads pony, then they've done a good job and they've read because they've understood the meaning of the text. No, they didn't read. They guessed the word based on the context. So they weren't reading it. They were just using other skills like reasoning skills to figure out what word might naturally fit there. But that is not reading. And we need to differentiate between reading and being able to extract meaning.
I had a
from
teacher
text.
tell me that my son, who was homeschooled, was not a reader. He was just a decoder. And I said, "Really, is that North or South Dakota?" And then she said to me, she said, "Actually, it doesn't matter if you read the word house as home or read the word home as house because they're the same thing." And I said, "Really? They're the same thing? Is that what Dorothy said in The Wizard of Oz when she clicked her ruby slippers together? Did she say, 'There's no place like house'? There's no place like house?" Or how about House, house on the range where the deer and the antelope play? Or is it home, home on the range? And these people think that words don't mean anything. And you can just guess. You could substitute one word for another. You can memorize words as a whole picture, as if you're Chinese. They teach English as if it was Mandarin. And that's why
exactly right.
the kids born in America read it as if it was Mandarin, which is completely insane or intentionally insane.
Yeah, it is. And, it was deliberate. I think Americans now are some of the most illiterate people in the world. It's interesting. Even the Soviets, they actually tried this for a little while, and then they went back to doing it the proper way. And they had the advantage of not allowing their slaves to read anything. So the slaves could read, they just couldn't access any text that they wanted. They could only read government-approved propaganda, but they still wanted them to be able to read so they could read scientific papers, so they could develop. But Americans, free people, were targeted for this orchestrated dumbing down program, and it's been incredibly successful today. I mean, even in Sweden, they teach with phonics. They teach with phonics in normal places, but the countries that have been targeted for destruction, for dumbing down, especially the countries that still had a lot of individual liberty, you see this quackery. And, the example you gave is very, very typical of what's coming, even out of some of these elite universities. You have, Harvard doctors of education promoting this insane idea that as long as you read something that was similar to what was written there, then you've read what was there. And it goes right into this postmodern idea that whatever the person actually wrote there doesn't even matter. You get to decide what the meaning of what the person intended to write was. And that is not actually reading. That is not, it doesn't make any sense at all, unless you're really trying to destroy education and destroy a civilization, which I think is what's happening here.
What's interesting is that these so-called doctors of education, it is not a PhD, it's a DED. Mm-hmm. So even the schools are embarrassed, the universities, to try to correlate a doctor of education with an actual PhD. Even they, because a DED, if it's a PhD, would be piled high and deep. That would be the meaning of the acronym. Anyway, we're going to have Daniel do a little reading for us. And it's the author is Robert Kiyosaki, who is actually, I believe, Japanese of Hawaiian origin. So he's Japanese origin from Hawaii. And he wrote, of course, the famous Rich Dad, Poor Dad books. And he also has a book out called Fake Money and Fake Education, because he's very well aware of this. So we're going to have Daniel read a little bit. Whatever you want to read.
Chapter 7, Overcoming Obstacles. The primary difference between a rich person and a poor person is how they manage fear. Once people have studied and become financially literate, they may still face roadblocks to becoming financially independent. There are 5 main reasons why financially literate people may still not develop abundant asset columns that could produce a large cash flow. The 5 reasons are fear, cynicism, laziness, bad habits, and arrogance.
There you go. Arrogance. Aha, the arrogance of their ignorance.
That was awesome, Daniel. Good job.
We have people today that read nothing. They know nothing. All they do is repeat a bunch of bromides and platitudes. They cannot think individually. They walk around with masks like the seals at SeaWorld, those famous seals. I will wear a mask. I will obey. I will obey. Jawohl, I will obey. And they don't question anything. If you told them to put a mask over their entire body, they would do it. They would get a body condom, like in that movie with Priscilla Presley and Leslie Nielsen. I mean, these people don't question anything. At least the hippies of the 60s, as radical left as they were, they had a slogan called "Question Authority." And that's what we need to do. That's healthy. We want kids who question things and don't just repeat like a bunch of SeaWorld seals balancing the ball on their nose. So could you give us, by the way, a few quotes from the people that we're accusing of planning on doing this? You have any quotes that are handy?
Yeah, well, Robert Owen actually wrote, he was a communist before communism was cool. And he actually wrote several essays on why government ought to control education. This was as his communist commune in Indiana was failing. Then you had Horace Mann, and he actually said one of the purposes of having government control education was, and I quote, to equalize all men, right? Now, why would you want all men to be equal? It's one thing to be equal under the law. It's a completely different thing to have all men be equal. If they're equal, that means they're not free, because free people, some will work harder, some will be smarter, some will be dumber, some will work less, some will have different interests. Of course, free people cannot be equal and equal people cannot be free. But the architect, the guy who introduced government education to America from Prussia, said one of his goals was to equalize all men. Then you have John Dewey. I mean, the number of quotes from John Dewey is just astonishing. When he went to the Soviet Union and started writing these articles for the New Republic about how wonderful it was, you could take quotes all day from there. But he was very clear. He was one of the co-authors of the Humanist Manifesto. And this is another document that's filled with quotes revealing his agenda, his ideology, right? The very first plank, and this is a direct quote from their Humanist Manifesto, is, "We religious humanists believe the universe is self-existing and not created," which is a direct full frontal assault on the very first words in the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created, right? And it's also a fundamental attack on the principles that America was founded on. America was founded on the idea that God created us, that God endowed us with inalienable rights, and that we institute governments to protect those rights. If you believe, as John Dewey does, according to the first tenet of his fake religion, that the universe is self-existing and not created, well, then you reject the Bible, you reject the existence of God, and you reject the concept of God-given rights. So this is really what animated John Dewey. He wanted to move away from what he considered to be an individualistic society that was obsessed with freedom and individual rights, and toward a collectivistic society. In fact, he told us the model he wanted to pursue was, it was a book written by Edward Bellamy called Looking Backward. And it was a fantasy novel about a communist America in the year 2000, where they had done away with private property. This was his goal. And, in fairness to John Dewey, I mean, I guess he didn't get to live to see all the horrors of these ideologies of socialism, of communism. He didn't see the National Socialism of the Germans. He didn't see the full-blown international socialism of Joseph Stalin. He didn't see the international socialism of Chairman Mao. But he had these very flawed ideas, and he was very open about them. So that's, I think, one of the incredible things is that they left us a huge trail of evidence to find out where they were coming from. And unfortunately, they don't reveal this all to teachers in public schools that are being trained in colleges of education. And he did one really neat trick. Every time he was talking about socialism, he put in the word democracy. And so if you actually read when he talks about democracy in context, he's very clearly talking about socialism, but they can present some of these writings to the people in the government education system and say, look, John Dewey was a big fan of democracy, setting aside the fact, of course, that America was never intended to be a democracy. In Federalist 10, the father of our Constitution, James Madison, said democracy is a horrible form of government, and nobody's rights are going to be safe. The correct form of government would be a republic, a constitutional republic. But anyways, they left a lot of evidence about what they believed.
Democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on
what's for dinner.
Right?
That's right. Yes, and you don't want to be the sheep.
Goes with the wolves.
That's right. That's right.
So, what's your message to parents of today, the ones that have an IQ left in their head, to try to remedy this?
Well, I would say, parents, I don't care what state you're in. I don't care if you're in a conservative state or a liberal state. If you want your children to get a decent education, you must remove them from public schools. There's going to be no salvaging it. And there's a lot of parents out there who think, well, if I can just unbrainwash them during dinner, then everything's going to be fine. No, it's not going to be fine, right? You're talking about handing your children over to a government for 20,000 hours of their childhood. If you're a really hyper involved parent, you might spend 4,000 or 5,000 hours with your child. The government's going to have them for 20,000. If you think you're going to be able to undo all the damage that the government has done in that time, including the illiteracy, including the lack of basic math skills, including the indoctrination, phony history, phony science, right? If you think you're going to be able to undo that in a few hours every afternoon during dinner and maybe during breakfast, you're kidding yourself. If you love your children and want to ensure that they have a good education, that they can read, that they can think, that they have some understanding of what came before us, you're really down to just a handful of options: homeschool, private school, or some kind of hybrid, some kind of co-op or some kind of online school that isn't affiliated with the government, like the Freedom Project Academy. And that really is your option. And I know it requires a financial sacrifice. I know it requires a commitment of time. It means you can't maybe drive that 2019 BMW and live in your Manhattan penthouse. But hey, if the well-being of your children comes below those things on your priority list, you really ought to re-examine your priority list, I think.
Yeah, I call these parents Toys R Us parents. They have kids the way they buy a toy, and then they put it on the shelf and it's not used again. These parents, I think they claim that they love their kids, but how could you put up with this if you truly love your kids? Obviously, you must love yourself and your material gain a lot more. And one thing I really do admire about a lot of Orthodox Hasidic Jews is that a lot of them are not at all wealthy. And it is amazing how they're able to send their kids to religious schools and zero public schools. If you're wealthy, it's not a problem, but a lot of these people sacrifice a lot to be able to do that. And I find it to be very admirable. And it's probably also true about a lot of born-again Christians and others as well. It isn't only so-called religious people, but I think it's a question of character. A person of character feels an obligation to the next generation. This will be the first generation that will do worse than their parents in the United States. Up until now, progressively, like for example, I was the first person in my family to ever go to college, let alone law school. My father was sent to reform school. He never even made it into high school. And my mother actually eventually got a GED, but that was like a big deal. And today, of course, they go to college and they go to grad school and they know less than an elementary school graduate knew a long time ago. So,
and that's not even an exaggeration.
No,
that's the truth.
No, I mean, they recently did a basic civics test at Harvard University. I think it was Harvard. I think it was actually all the Ivy League schools. And the average grade was 50% correct. And these were not difficult questions. These people have no idea. I had somebody tell me the other day I'm breaking the law. I think I told you that story where I wasn't wearing a mask and I asked him, what's a law? They think it's whatever some politician tells you have to do. They don't even know what a law is. They don't understand that the role of the legislature is to make laws. The obligation of the chief executive, whether it's federal or state, is to make sure that the laws and the Constitution are faithfully executed. And the judge, whether it's the Supreme Court of the state or the Supreme Court of the United States, his only job is to apply the Constitution or the law to the case. Yet you learn in law school, I should say you falsely learn in law school, Supreme Court decision, law of the land. Nonsense. It isn't the law of the land. It's the law in that case, in that the judge decided the case that way. But nobody knows any of this. We have an immensely ignorant population. Just go on Facebook one day and take a look at the comments you get on Facebook. Nobody has a clue. It's all emotion. You have the Trump people on one side who reflexively, if Trump mass murdered 1 million people, they'd find a reason why it's wonderful. And then on the other side, if Trump does something great, they'll find a reason why it's terrible and why Biden is the second coming or the first coming, whichever way you want to believe. I mean, nobody has the ability today to be an umpire, like an umpire in baseball. If the pitch is over the plate, you call it a strike. If it's outside the plate, you call it a ball. Doesn't matter if the pitcher is Republican, if the pitcher is Democrat. Have some character. Judge, remember what Robert Welch said. Trust not the politician, but put your faith and put your trust in the Constitution and bind them down, as Jefferson said, with the chains of the Constitution. But when you don't have any principles, you can't have those chains. And this is why we are where we are. So a few conclusory thoughts from you.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. And, I think this really is the issue that is going to define what happens in the years and in the decades ahead. I mean, the situation is so bad. Now, I've done some experiments like this on people in my own family who have gone through public schools. They don't know why we celebrate the 4th of July. They don't know who we declared independence from. They don't know who we fought in World War II. They are completely clueless when it comes to having some context around what's going on, where we came from, where we're going. It's just complete and total ignorance. This is exactly what the establishment wanted. And, the founding fathers explained it well. Anyone who thinks that they're going to remain ignorant and free is expecting what never has been and never will be. And the Hebrew scriptures have similar concepts in there. In Hosea, we hear that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. In Isaiah, we hear that my people went into captivity for lack of knowledge. Being a bunch of ignorant morons. And that's, presented to us as the cool thing, right? If you're dumb, if you don't know anything, that's cool. And the girls are supposed to think that's cool. If you're smart and you know things, oh, you're a nerd, you're a loser. This kind of attitude is quite literally going to destroy the United States.
That's why Daniel has so many girlfriends, because he's a genius.
Right. That's awesome. But I mean, it's a crisis of immense proportions, and our country and our liberty is not going to survive if we don't deal with this. So, if people are interested in learning more, we've got that book, Crimes of the Educators. I'll be coming out with a new book soon. I wrote a series in the Epic Times, which is a national newspaper, actually an international newspaper published by Chinese dissidents. I've done a series on education in there that will be turning into a book very soon. It's got all the history. And then we've also got this here. Very simple, very cost-effective, Rescuing Our Children. So it's just one special issue of the New American Magazine. You can get it at thenewamerican.com/rescuing our children, and it'll give you the history. It'll give you the future, where this is all going. They're trying to create a global school board with world core curriculum education standards, the dumbing down, the sexualization. So this is, I think, one of the most important battles facing the American people and people of faith, people who love freedom, people who believe in the family. This is the issue that crosses through all of them. And if we don't take it seriously, we're going to lose it all. So I hope people who heard this will go out there and educate themselves, so that then they can help educate their children, their communities. We've got to do it. There's no shortcuts. There's not going to be any, knight in shining armor that's going to show up and save our liberty at the last moment if we don't take care to make sure that we educate ourselves and educate those around us.
Well, Alex Newman, as always, a great pleasure. And we'll be speaking again. And once again, everybody get his book, Crimes of the Educators by Alex Newman. God bless.
Thanks so much, Bob. God bless you too.